Okay, so, you've brought us some pretty intense stuff this time.
Yeah.
It's all about the Epstein Files, and we're talking, huge amounts of documents, those infamous flight logs, and all the records tied to Jeffrey Epstein's, his really disturbing activities.
Yeah, you got it. And like you asked, our goal with this deep dive is to kind of go deeper than those headlines and really try to pull out the big takeaways from these files.
Mhm.
What do they tell us about power, about all the ways corruption works, the idea of, holding people accountable and what it all means for the rest of us, bigger picture stuff.
Yeah, and it's a case that people are still thinking about a lot, I think, because the accusations were so shocking, like, the abuse and exploitation of these young women, and then you add in the mystery around Epstein's death. It's a really disturbing situation.
Yeah.
So let's just jump right into those files. What's the first big thing that jumps out at you from this stuff?
Well, one of the first things that becomes clear from these sources is that Epstein wasn't like a lone wolf. This wasn't just one guy acting on his own. The material really emphasizes how big his network was. These connections, they reached into the highest levels of society. We're talking politicians, royalty, major players in business, and big time celebrity.
That's okay. So let's break that down a bit because, you hear that and it's easy to feel overwhelmed. But the sources say these files give us a glimpse into this whole web of connections. And it wasn't just about, being friends, right? It was about how Epstein allegedly used these relationships.
Exactly. The information suggests that Epstein really he cultivated these relationships and then he manipulated them to get access to people with power, access to a ton of wealth, and access to global influence on a scale that's really concerning. This seems to have been way more than just networking. It looks like it played a big part in letting him do these criminal things. And maybe even more importantly, it probably helped shield him from any real consequences for a really long time. The sources kind of hint that he was very deliberate about getting into these circles.
And those flight logs from his private jet, the Lolita Express, they keep coming up. What's so important about those when we're trying to understand this network?
The thing about those logs is that they might give us at least some solid evidence of who was actually traveling with Epstein. Now, obviously, just being on a flight with him doesn't automatically mean you knew about or were involved in his crimes. But some of the sources point out that the frequency of these flights and the timing, those things could reveal patterns and connections that definitely need to be looked at more closely. Who were these people? Did they have any idea what was going on? Those logs are a really crucial piece of the puzzle in understanding how big his network really was.
Yeah, it really shows you how influence can be used, doesn't it? Now let's shift gears a little bit and think about the human impact of all this. What could these files mean for the survivors of Epstein's abuse?
If we think about what the survivors had been through, those files become incredibly important. As the material says, these documents represent the potential for justice. After years of alleged exploitation and all the trauma that comes with that, the files give them a concrete hope that the people who hurt them or who helped make it happen might finally be held accountable for what they did.
That's a really key point. It's not just about creating a historical record. It's about the very real possibility of legal action and maybe even a sense of personal reckoning for anyone who is complicit in the abuse.
Exactly. The information we have suggests that the files could be used to identify people who were directly involved in the abuse or who knew it was happening and let it continue. This could lead to new investigations, legal action that should have happened a long time ago, and ultimately some measure of justice that a lot of survivors haven't gotten yet.
Hmm.
There's also the possibility, as some people have pointed out, that we might find out about more people in positions of power who were connected to Epstein but haven't been publicly linked to him yet.
And the importance of that for the survivors, in terms of giving them some kind of closure, it's hard to really understand that unless you've been through something similar. It's not just about punishment. It's about acknowledging the huge amount of harm that was done and finally seeing someone held accountable.
Exactly. The files are vital in this context because they could potentially offer that accountability, which is a fundamental step in the incredibly difficult process of healing and finding some sense of closure after these awful experiences.
Now, the Epstein case has always had these lingering questions about how someone with his history could operate so freely for so long. The sources talk about the lack of transparency. Can you explain why that's been such a big issue?
It really makes you question the whole system. The material you've shared highlights the controversy around Epstein's first plea deal back in 2008, which a lot of people thought was way too lenient. And then there were the reports of how he was allegedly treated in prison, which suggested he was getting special privileges. The files become really important because they could shed light on how this was all possible. Did the justice system fail in some way and let him slip through the cracks? where there's specific instances of corruption or even bigger conspiracies, like some people have suggested. Some sources even argue that the plea deal itself was a sign that the system wasn't working the way it should.
So the files aren't just about understanding Epstein's inner circle. They could actually reveal much bigger problems within the legal system and the government itself.
Yeah, that's a key point. The documents have the potential to show whether people in positions of power within the justice system, government agencies, or law enforcement might have been protecting Epstein or deliberately overlooking what he was doing. If the files show evidence of that, it would be a huge betrayal of public trust and would raise serious concerns about whether our legal system is actually fair and impartial.
It really makes you think about how much wealth and influence can affect legal outcomes. The sources also mention the unprecedented media attention that this case has gotten. Why is that continued public interest so important?
The fact that the media has been all over this and the public keeps demanding answers to those things are absolutely essential. The sources explain that the files are a big part of keeping that public interest going, and even more importantly, they're putting pressure on authorities to keep investigating and to explore every possible avenue for justice. Without all that attention, there's a real danger that the case could fade from public view, and then any chance of holding people accountable could be lost.
So in a way, the media is like a watchdog, using the information in these files to keep the pressure on and to make sure the whole story comes out and doesn't get buried.
Exactly. The material emphasizes how important the media has been in bringing the Epstein case to light in the first place, and how new revelations from the files can keep it in the public eye. All that scrutiny is a powerful way to make sure the investigations continue, and that there's public pressure for transparency and accountability.
And it's not just about passively reporting on what's released, right? It's about investigative journalists really digging deeper, connecting the dots, and asking the tough questions that make people uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Investigative journalists who can get access to these files have a huge responsibility. They need to carefully analyze everything, look for patterns and inconsistencies, and just relentlessly pursue any leads that could uncover even bigger and more groundbreaking information. The files themselves might just be raw data, but it's the skilled investigative work that can turn all those individual pieces into a complete and understandable story.
The sources also make a really important point by saying that Epstein's alleged actions weren't just some weird, isolated incident. They could actually point to a much bigger system of exploitation, abuse, and manipulation that's tied to wealth and power. Can you talk more about that systemic aspect?
This is where things get really serious. The Epstein Files, according to the material, are crucial for understanding how these larger systems of exploitation actually work in the real world. How do wealth and power create opportunities for abuse? How do people in authority manage to avoid being held accountable, often for years and years? The files might give us valuable insights into the specific ways that Epstein's alleged criminal operation was able to not only exist but actually thrive for so long.
So we're talking about things like corrupt legal processes, secret financial transactions that hid where the money was going, and hidden networks of influence that provided protection. These are all parts of this larger system.
Exactly. The sources point to those kinds of things as ways that Epstein's alleged crimes might have been able to go unchecked for so long. By carefully going through the information in the files, we might get a much clearer picture of how these underlying systems work, and most importantly, how we can challenge them and ultimately dismantle them so these kinds of abuses can't happen again.
So it's not just about looking back at what happened in this case, it's also about learning from it so we can prevent this kind of exploitation and abuse from happening in the future. Finally, the sources connect the Epstein files to the whole conversation about criminal justice reform. How does this case fit into that bigger discussion?
If we think about criminal justice reform as a whole, the Epstein case really highlights some major flaws in how our legal system handles cases involving people with a lot of power and money. It's definitely sparked discussions about the need for more transparency at every level of the justice system, for better ways to hold people accountable to make sure no one is above the law, and for stronger protections for people who are vulnerable to exploitation.
And what happens in the end, whether all the files are made public and whether everyone who's responsible is held accountable, could that set a precedent for future cases involving wealthy and powerful people?
Absolutely. The material suggests that a thorough and unbiased investigation of the Epstein files, and then actually holding anyone who did something wrong accountable, that could be a really big deal. It could send a clear message that even people with tons of money and influence can't escape the law, and that the system is committed to justice for everyone, regardless of their status or connections.
And practically speaking, that could lead to real changes in specific areas, right? Like laws about sex trafficking, making judges and other legal professionals more accountable, and the way victims of abuse are treated and supported within the legal system.
Exactly. The Epstein case has the potential to really push for meaningful reform in those crucial areas. By showing the failures and shortcomings that this case has exposed, the information in the files could ultimately help create a more just equitable and effective legal system for everyone.
So to sum it all up, it sounds like these Epstein files are way more than just a bunch of old documents.
You got it. As the sources all suggest, they could be the key to unlocking this hidden world of exploitation and impunity that's been operating for way too long.
And there are so many reasons why they matter. They could expose these complicated networks of power and influence. They could help bring some long overdue justice to the victims. They could highlight the need for more transparency in our justice system. They could keep the public informed and engaged with this important issue. They could help us understand the systemic problems that allow this kind of terrible abuse to happen. And ultimately, they could drive real change in criminal justice reform.
Exactly. And as long as those files aren't fully released and investigated properly, both justice for the victims and real transparency in our legal system and society as a whole will be compromised.
It really leaves you with a lot to think about. Think about how power structures can, on one hand, make it possible for horrible things to happen, and on the other hand, work to hide the truth and protect the people responsible. What's the role of transparency, not just in this specific case, but in making sure that anyone with power is held accountable for their actions, no matter how rich or connected they are? That's something we all need to keep thinking about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.